you. People can hear you now.
Let's go. Let's go.
You can start.
Okay. Muy buenas tardes. Perdona la molestia. Y gracias, Camila, por organizar esto. Muy interesante. Hoy pretendo explicar la política comercial externa de la administración de Trump. Digo eso porque no es, normalmente uno diría la política externa comercial de los Estados Unidos, pero el punto probablemente más importante para el futuro, esta no es la política de Estados Unidos, es la política de Trump, Lighthizer, Navarro, y todos, digo la verdad y es lamentable, pero es una política de nostalgia. Y voy a inglés para explicar todo, pero si hay preguntas en español, es perfecto. So the trade policy of the Trump administration is not the trade policy of the United States. It's opposed by most of Congress. It's opposed by 99% of the U.S. business community. It's opposed by 99.9% of the U.S. farm community. They'd much rather have a different policy. Obviously, there are some people who say, well, it's working, etc., but everyone would have preferred a different approach, as I will show you. So I'm going to discuss 3 topics, 3 points today in order. First, what the trade policy of the Trump administration has been until now, what the trade policy of the Trump administration has been since the onset of the virus, and third and last, what happens to trade policy with our elections in this November. To start with, as I mentioned, this is a policy, the substance. Until now, it's been a policy of nostalgia for the year 1960. And if that sounds weird, that's what it is. And the misogyny and racism are part of this whole nostalgia. Trump, Lighthizer, Navarro, all are over 70. I think Navarro is, the other 2 are. And this is when they were growing up. And when they were growing up, the U.S. was unquestionably the largest, most important economy. Essentially, everything sold in the U.S. was made in the U.S. There are a few very rare exceptions. But the total imports were well under 5% of the GDP. They're now around 30, I think. So this is all very disturbing. Why are we buying all these foreign goods when we used to make them? And this downplays the role of exports and the economy in which the U.S., like every other country, needs economies of scale to survive domestically. They have to sell internationally. And that's true for most companies now, both big and small, or at least medium. They count on being able to sell in all markets. To take the obvious example, if Boeing only sold in the US, which is about a third of its business, then the number of planes would be 2/3 smaller. The unit cost would be pretty much the same for overhead, R&D, etc. The cost of the plane would double or triple. Airlines couldn't afford them because passengers wouldn't pay that much, etc. So the Boeing story, Boeing was one of the first of the big exporters, but it's true for almost everyone. U.S. soybean farmers sell export around half of what they do. So the basic rule for Trump trade policy until now is anything sold in the U.S. really should be made here. This shows up in several different ways. The whole attack on China, they imposed high tariffs on China, knowing there would likely be retaliation by China against U.S. exports and not caring. The attempts to extend Buy America rules to services, All services should be made here. The attack on the WTO is because the WTO had the power to overrule their decisions. And the WTO, I should note, is not some organization in Geneva, it's the members. It's the 165 countries. The employees of the WTO, which is very small, do what the members tell it. So the US is complaining that it has to share power with other countries. And that's the Trump administration's view. The US shouldn't have to share power with anyone. That was 1960, it's not now. So this shows up in a lot of, so basically if you look at their policies, the attempts to foment more and more Buy America, the attempts to get out from under of any previous agreements by the U.S. to share power, and that's basically what their policy has been in trade. So that's the main aspect. The second aspect is it's very corrupt administration, to be blunt. So it's no accident that the first thing they did was very high tariffs on steel. The Secretary of Commerce, Wilbur Ross, owned steel mills and was on the board of the biggest steel maker until he became Secretary of Commerce. Also on the board and vice chairman of the board of the Bank of Cyprus. You can figure that out pretty easily. And so they prefer steel to automobiles, for example. So Lighthizer for 30 plus years was a lobbyist for the steel industry. He may not have registered as a lobbyist, but that's what he was doing. The Trump's sort of personal trade advisor was the former CEO of a U.S. steel company. So first it was tariffs on steel, but autos, for example, pays the price for that. So there's a visible preference of steel, the steel industry, which employs 100 to 140,000 people out of 160 million, to autos, which employs far more people. So you see it in steel, you see it with NAFTA. NAFTA is basically, he imposed higher costs on U.S. automakers, but in part by requiring the use of more U.S. steel. And then China, of course, started with steel, but then kept going. And as I mentioned, they didn't really care that there would be retaliation. So, and then the third part is they're not very competent. And so the best example, Trump on his first day at work destroyed Trans-Pacific Partnership, took the U.S. out. The other members got together, notably including all the Latin American ones, Chile, Mexico, Peru, and saved it. But the U.S. is out. So the U.S. lost all the access to foreign markets it got in TPP. So Trump said he would replace it. He'd do something better. What has he done in 3 years? Because it's 3+ years since he destroyed TPP. Well, the main gain in market access for the U.S. in the new NAFTA, USMCA, he got an increase in access to the Canadian dairy market. He got it from 3.25% in TPP up to 3.59%. That's pretty small. And he had to open the U.S. market to Canada accordingly. He got some access to Japan, but only for some agricultural products, nothing with any of the others. So basically, it's a major loss of TPP and hasn't been replaced. USMCA actually is slightly more restrictive, but it took 3 years. In fact, it's not going into effect now until July 1. So that's 3 years of uncertainty. Those of you, anyone in business knows, uncertainty has a cost. And he created a lot of uncertainty with in the North American space of US, Canada, and Mexico. And US-China is best represented by a poll of the major businesses that do business with China. And so what the US-China deal, Trump says he got Chinese agreement to buy a lot more stuff. So there was a poll of U.S. businesses, and the U.S. businesses said, yeah, they like those promises, and some, but it wasn't worth the cost of the disruption of the last 3 years. So again, so far, U.S.-China is negative for the U.S. economy. The bottom line, to summarize, there's a nonpartisan economic analytic group in our Congress, which said that Trump's trade policy to date will cost the U.S. 0.5% of GDP in 5 years. So that doesn't sound like much, 0.5, but if you're only growing at 2.3, 2.2, now we're in deep decline, that's a big hit. I should add, by the way, if this sounds partisan, I'm not being partisan. I am a Democrat, but I'm not a very partisan one, and I've worked with Republicans. A lot of my Republican friends share this analysis. So, second point, what is the trade policy of the Trump administration been post-virus? So you still have anything made here anything sold here should be made here, but it's obviously doesn't work in a period of a pandemic. So we're letting the free market out. Free market still is determining a lot of the supply and demand for medical supplies. So the world market is busy buying things we produce here, trying to import. And so even though the mantra of the Trump administration is anything sold here should be made here, that goes by the boards. It also means we're paying more for our medical supplies. Secondly, it still retains a little bit of the corruption, can't give it up. So just to give you an example, all of our tax payments at a federal level, the income tax, has been postponed 3 months. So keep cash flow going to companies. So it was proposed to also postpone the collection of any tariffs for 3 months for the same reasons. And they agreed to that finally a couple of days ago. I don't think it's been published fully, but they've agreed, except for the steel tariffs and the China tariffs. So people who import steel still have to come up with the cash flow out of their cash flow with the money for the steel tariffs, which are quite high, and the China tariffs. So, and the fact that might close businesses and throw them out of work, which is not a good thing in the current environment, doesn't matter. He's taking care of his friends. And the third part is they're not competent, and you've seen this. We should have been in a lockdown a month earlier. They had the data. Everyone, it was public. They didn't order machines in time, the ventilators. They didn't even order enough face masks. They basically are way too late. It's a complete failure to manage the system. So in economic terms, what we have is, for what medical supplies there are, all 50 states have been told by the president that they should go out and compete with each other to buy them. Instead of normally the federal government would organize the purchasing, so get lower prices and allocate them based on need. Now all the states are competing with each other and with foreign countries. So as I mentioned, part of the U.S. supplies going overseas, you can debate whether that's good policy or not for the world, but it means we are competing for other people, for supplies made by other people. And if you want a bit of irony, it means Chinese suppliers have been able to raise their prices for things we buy. So even though they're trying to attack China, they're busy giving Chinese suppliers a windfall. So this is not a very pretty picture. My apologies. So let me turn to sort of a better picture. Um, we have elections in November. I have no idea who's going to win, but I want to give you an analytic framework for them. There are three possible plausible outcomes. I should add a legal note first. Legally, we have to have the elections, and indeed, Trump has to have the elections. The Constitution says he's no longer president January 20th, 21. It says there's nothing in the Constitution says he can postpone the elections or declare himself president for life or anything else. There's no such power. And so January 21, if there's no election, he's gone. So he has to have an election. So there will be elections. And the Republicans said to say, we'll try to steal them. But we'll see if that works. But there are three possible outcomes. One, Trump wins and the Republicans keep the Senate. In that case, the trade policy, more likely than not, is more of the same for 4 years. The Democrats control the House, but USMCA showed that they could get some stuff in trade agreements that have to be voted on, but a lot of the Trump stuff does not require votes. The agreement with Japan, the agreement with China, there's no vote, although that's of dubious legality, but there's no vote. So basically 4 more years are the same, which is bad for our economy and therefore bad for the world economy and for businesses, because we will keep losing the part of GDP growth that comes from trade. As I mentioned, the analysis so far by a respected nonpartisan group is we're down 0.5% of GDP. That would continue for 4 more years. Second possibility, you have a Democratic president and a Democratic Senate and a Democratic House, and USMCA gives you some hints of what they would do. One is you'll have much more emphasis on labor rights and some more emphasis on environmental improvements in our trade policy. But some people say, well, Democrats are protectionist. What you saw with USMCA is the leadership of the party, certainly having lived through Trump and seen the effects of Trump's protectionism on their constituents, I think will be less protectionist than Democrats have been in the past. And it's worth remembering the Obama administration certainly had its moments of protectionism. All governments do, but it tried to negotiate major agreements with through TPP and with Europe with TTIP. So depending on, and so if Biden is the candidate and wins and controls the Senate and the House, it starts looking somewhat like the Obama administration, although a harder line than the Obama administration on China, because that narrative has now won out politically. The third possibility is Trump loses the Senate and the House, but wins the presidency. This is actually quite unlikely, not for legal reasons, but just politically. If you look at data from the past, Trump was a minority government. He won 3 million less votes than Clinton. So if it's a close election and he wins, then he would not win the House back and not win the Senate. A lot of people vote the same party all the way down the ballot. So if Trump wins, it's unlikely he would lose the Senate and the House. He would probably hold on to the Senate. But if he does, which is the first option, so this third option of Trump losing the Senate and the House but winning the presidency is unlikely for electoral reasons. But if he did, then we'd have a major constitutional crisis going on for 4 years. And I don't know what the outcome would be, because he would not simply say, well, I have to get along with the House and the Senate. You've seen that. And that would obviously basically lead to a very random trade policy. To summarize, it's not been a good trade policy for the US or for the world economy. And there's been a lot of very random things. There's a core belief in let's go back to 1960, and it's not been successful. If you look at what they've been able to accomplish in their trade policy, it's just not successful. So we don't need 4 more years of it. Thank you. Mil gracias. Feliz charlar con ustedes, en inglés o en castellano.
Thank you, Gary. Thank you so much. I'm so sorry that we couldn't see you on the screen. People are asking me, what about the presentation? And I'm like, Gary doesn't like doing PowerPoint presentations. So please, people, understand that there is no PowerPoint presentation.
Well, let me explain. Doing a PowerPoint presentation means your attention is divided. And we all know that we can multitask forever, but every study shows you cannot do 2 things at once. So with luck, you were listening to my presentation. I'm sorry I wasn't on screen. That would have helped. But
at least they were not distracted seeing you, but only listening to you. So thank you, Gary. Thank you so much. I have some questions here. If you don't mind, I'll share some. Gary, could you tell me what measures the UN is taking to end this problem between China and the US?
Right. United Nations doesn't play a large role in trade policy, at least so far. The United Nations basically leaves that to the World Trade Organization mainly, and with support from the World Bank and the IMF. So the decision-making process in the United Nations right now, especially with the Trump administration, means that I wouldn't want to assign a large role to the UN. I note that the UN, at least for now, is the convener, at least, and coordinator of climate change. I didn't get into climate change, but climate change is going to drive a lot of trade policy. And the US, as long as Trump is president, will fight that all the way. But the reality of climate change will eventually have some effect. And that's a UN-driven process. So some trade policy, possibly a lot, will be made through the UN climate change process.
Okay, thank you, Gary. One question, Gary, where do you see globalization is going?
Well, globalization, obviously, there's no guarantee of it. We are literally 100 years after the end of the last piece of globalization. If you go back to the world in 1913, it was very globalized. And there was pretty much freer trade than now, free immigration in most places, free movement of capital. So and people forget this. If you go back and look at certainly in big cities all over the world, including Latin America, including China, including Europe, including North America, you'll see they look a lot alike. The building styles, the railroads, the clothing, everyone's drinking the same brands of champagne all over the world. World War I destroyed that, and it never got fully rebuilt after World War I. And so countries started over after World War II, first with the GATT and then WTO. And that's the structures. And the economics did the same thing. The Boeing example I gave is not particularly unique. It's not unique at all. If you're going to build a semiconductor plant, the variable cost of a semiconductor in the end is sand. It's where you get the silicon. And I realize it's not that simple. It's polysilicon and a few other things, but basically most of the cost of a semiconductor is research and development and some bricks and mortar. So you had the costs of a semiconductor plant are huge, and you have to amortize that over huge sales, and that means more than selling in your own country, even if your country is the US. And just to give you an example, the Trump attacks on Huawei, and I'm not taking sides in it. I don't know either side of that debate well enough. Trump's attacks on Huawei would have seriously hurt. Huawei was the largest customer, or the second largest customer for several of the big important US semiconductor producers. And so losing Huawei would have greatly disadvantaged US producers. Best example I can give you is automobiles. The largest producers of automobiles in China are Volkswagen and General Motors. Chrysler was the first foreign producer in China, and it didn't work, Chrysler's venture. I don't know why. I'm not blaming Chrysler. So Chrysler, because it didn't have Chinese production, was sold off to Fiat by the government, whereas General Motors, with a strong Chinese one, could justify standing alone and eventually having an IPO. And the IPO would not have been successful probably if GM only sold in North America, but it's also strong in other continents and China. So globalization is, just to extend this a little, and this goes back to Adam Smith, the 18th century, more or less inventor of economics. And so Smith's example was that if you made pins and one person, a skilled worker, could make one pin an hour, just little straight pins, and one worker, drawing the wire, capping it, etc., maybe one an hour. Whereas a group of them in a factory could make thousands an hour by splitting up the tasks. And this is before much mechanization, etc. It's just, and his point was, you could only do that if you could sell the pins outside your village. So this whole idea of international trade is actually misleading. It's trade outside your village. And so the real push for globalization came from the invention of the railroad in 1829 in the UK, the first steamships going between the US and the UK starting in 1819, but really the first scheduled trips in 1840, and the telegraph in 1844. So that's a long time ago, but once you had those, you could sell outside your village and indeed outside this artificial boundary called a country. So globalization is simply as transportation improved, and don't laugh, probably the most important event in post-war trade history was the container ship, but economically. But so all of those improvements in transportation mean there's no difference once you get rid of trade barriers between selling in your country and your neighbor. US-Canada is a perfect example. It's a lot less expensive to sell from Windsor, Ontario to Detroit, Michigan, which is how cars are assembled, than to sell from Tallahassee, Florida to Seattle, Washington.
Exactly. Great. Gary, I have a bunch of questions, but I know that your time is very, very precious. So
Go ahead.
You want another one?
Yeah, sure.
Um,
Ask me several. Ask me two or three.
okay, there's one that they're really asking me about. Could you please enlighten us on the US to are starting negotiations with Kenya towards getting to a free trade agreement? Question from Uruguay.
What's the last part of that? U.S. Kenya, and what's the question?
A free trade agreement between the US
Right.
and Kenya. And it's a question made
Yes.
from someone from Uruguay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I'll do that one. So U.S. Kenya is, again, Trump started with this really, I don't need trade agreements, etc. And now that didn't work very well within his party or with the business community. So, and he hasn't been able to do trade agreements. Instead, USMCA is mildly negative. China, he didn't do what he said he could do. And now none of it will work with the virus. And he got rid of TPP and replaced about 10% of it. So, and I'm not saying for the ag sectors that were benefited, which were not all, they did really well with China and Japan, but the economy as a whole, no. So basically, they haven't done much. So they want to show they're doing something. And then for sort of image reasons, they wanted to show they're doing something in Kenya, in Africa. Africa, as many of you know, just completed at a political level an Africa-wide free trade agreement covering all of Africa. And so Kenya, it's, though they may do one with the U.S., but this is not economically a big deal. It is for Kenya. Its impact on the U.S. economy and the world economy will be close to zero. People will be watching it, and many of you all should watch that agreement because it will show you where USTR, what kind of agreement USTR is looking for. But the much more important negotiation will be with the United Kingdom because it's the fifth largest economy in the world. And so so those two agreements, if you want to see where Trump's trade policy goes, it'd be through those two agreements.
Okay. And Gary, from what I understood, right now for the next 3 months, the US is a whole free trade zone because you were talking about 0% income tax, 0% of tariffs. So the whole USA is a free trade zone right now for the next 3 months? Or how do you see it?
They haven't eliminated tariffs and taxes. They just postponed when the money's due.
Oh, okay.
So anything coming in the next 3 months will still pay taxes and tariffs, but you don't have to income tax and tariffs, but you don't have to pay the federal government until 3 months. But having said that, there is still state, and that applies to tariffs completely. For income tax, and this shows you how federalized our system is. So I live in Washington, D.C., the District of Columbia. So they postponed the filing of tax returns to coordinate with the federal ones, but they required people who pay estimated taxes, which are small businesses, professionals, etc., to pay the money up now, like in 2 weeks, even though they don't have to file their tax returns for 3 months. So I don't have to pay the federal government or file a federal tax return for 3 months, but I don't have to file a state tax return for 3 months, but I have to pay the money for the state tax return now, but not the federal one. And that makes no sense, but that's the way our system works.
Okay. And one last question, Gary. How you foresee the outcome of the current oil crisis? Will the U.S. play a major role in this?
That's really interesting. So the last oil crises, the crises of the 70s and 80s, and into the 90s, the U.S. Was an importer, net importer, but it didn't export much. But it was a net importer of oil and gas, and so it had a major role. It was worried an oil crisis was something that concerned the U.S. To take the obvious example, the Gulf War, the U.S. wanted to make sure it had access, could purchase oil from the Middle East. But the U.S. now it's not self-sufficient in oil by any means. And I have to add one more technical factor. So a country the size of the U.S., for example, would export oil from some places. Alaskan oil is exported to Japan, can be exported to Japan, for example, while importing oil into the Gulf for refineries there. So it's not monolithic. Canada's in the same position. So the U.S. hasn't, but the most important impact now on the U.S., because the U.S. is, again, a net exporter of natural gas. It still imports a lot of gas from Mexico and from Canada, but net it's an exporter, I think, now. But so Trump likes to say we're self-sufficient in energy, or we're the #1 energy producer. We still have an interest in imports and exports, but the biggest impact is the prices. So the cheapest oil to produce is probably Saudi, and U.S. oil and gas is more expensive to produce than Saudi. So to some extent, the Saudis, by lowering the price, are undermining U.S. oil and gas producers. So I fully expect, if this goes on, the U.S. to do something protectionist on oil, in part because, again, the corruption. One of Trump's biggest backers owns a lot of oil and gas in the U.S. And he tends to do favors for his friends, so I fully expect him to do something. But overall, part of the most of this downturn in economic activity, which is very abrupt just from the virus, but in the oil and gas sector, it's because of the Saudi moves.
Okay. Well, Gary, thank you very, very, very much. We have right now 1,000. I think this is the biggest call you have had in your life. Is 1,000, almost 1,500 people. So I think it's the
for Sarah and Neil, ha sido realmente un gran placer.
Thank you. No, thank you so much. I'll leave your details on the chat for people that will contact you later, because I have more questions. No, but as you know, we're in a marathon. This is not this is like a Netflix marathon, but for free trade. So we will continue with our next speaker. And thank you so much.
Tell him to email me. Give him my email.
Yeah, I'll write it to everyone right now, and we will continue. I hope that you can join us in the other sessions that we will have, the ones you can join. But thank you so much, and thank you for the audience, for the patience, and just we had your voice, but I think that's enough for all of us that admire your work.
I truly apologize. I don't know what happened, because, as you mentioned, and I agree, it worked fine 2 days ago. Somehow it rejected my camera and microphone, and so that's why I called you. But anyhow, todo bien que fini bien.
Muchas gracias, Gary.
Hasta pronto.
Thank you. Bueno, estoy acá con speaker, celular, tratando todo. Vamos a seguir entonces con Martín Ibarra, que tuvimos antes el problema técnico y ya tengo entendido que ya está solucionado. Entonces vamos a seguir con Martín. Esto es una maratón, es realmente una maratón de comercio exterior, pero qué mejor momento para hacerlo en este momento que estamos todos en casa, que creo que nunca habíamos tenido tanto tiempo disponible en nuestras vidas para ser realmente pues eficientes y pensar. No veo a Martín. Los del equipo de Araujo y Barra que están preguntando, no veo a Martín conectado. No lo veo en línea para poderlo invitar. No sé si habrán cambiado el usuario o no lo veo. Le vamos a seguir, listo ya. Ahora sí ya lo veo. Ya le di la invitación a Martín para que acepte.